So the story of the binding of Isaac represents the culmination of Abraham's experience. And if you remember, he's already been tested by God severely. If you remember Avram and Sarai, who previously were unable to have a child, were tested with the birth of Ishmael, who obviously was Avram's first son by Hagar. And it isn't until Isaac comes later that the covenant is completed. But when Isaac is born, there's a sense in which the covenant is completed. The story is effectively over. We're going to move on from there. The nation of Israel will be from Isaac's seed, and we'll move on. But there's this last episode which represents this moment where God tests Abraham, and he tests the covenant too. And it's an important moment because for all three religions that come out of Abraham, so for the Jews, the Christians, and Muslims, they all view this in a distinct way. But we're going to be looking at it from a Jewish perspective. From an Islamic perspective, it's really about the absolute obedience to God. It's about the willingness to surrender completely to God's will. Christians tend to look at it as a little bit of a precursor to what happens to Jesus. So just as Jesus is willing to sacrifice himself for the fate of man, Abraham is willing to sacrifice his son for the sake of God. So we pick up the story. It's important to remember that just before this, Abraham has stood up for the people of Sodom and Gomorrah. And these were not innocent people. These were people that had committed some sort of grievous sin. And generally the assumption is it was some sort of sexual impropriety or iniquity. So they committed some sort of sexual sin, and God comes down and wants to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, the entire town. And Abraham comes in and begins to negotiate for the sake of the innocents in the town, because he says, well, certainly there are some innocent people in the town. If there are 50 innocent people, are you going to kill everyone, including those innocent people? And he basically negotiates with God to save the life of innocent people. So it's interesting that this happens right after that, because of course Isaac isn't innocent in this. There's no reason for Isaac to be part of this test. It calls into question why this happens in the first place. So if you begin the story and you look at where it starts, in Bereshit 21 or Genesis 21, you'll notice that the first line, it says that God tested Abraham. And so from the very beginning, we know that this is a test. We know that God is subjecting Abraham to this. The question is, why does he do this? It seems to me that Abraham has already passed a number of different tests, from the original call to the test of Ishmael to his patience throughout his life. But notice that the call to Abraham, the here I am, is the call back to God. That at the beginning, Abraham follows God's will, but now there's a conversation that's taking place between the two of them. Now notice that this begins with a request by God. Take your son, your only one whom you love, yea, Isaac, and go away to the land of Moriah and bring him up there for a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I will tell you. Well, look at this carefully. Because remember, Ishmael was his oldest son. And so he's not his only one. And so interesting, either God is not telling the truth here, or he's suggesting that the only son that matters in the eyes of God is Isaac, because he is the son of the covenant. But he has to also say, your only one whom you love. Yeah, Isaac. He has to convince Abraham that Isaac is his favorite son, because according to the way that the Torah is read, Ishmael was his favorite son. It was his older son. He had spent more time with Ishmael. Isaac was the younger son, and even though he was the completion of the covenant, there wasn't the same sort of personal relationship between Abraham and Isaac. And so this request is interesting because Moriah isn't somewhere close. It's 3 days away. So he's going to ask Abraham to do this and give him a lot of time to think about it. This isn't something that's going to happen quickly. It's going to happen over a period of time. So Abraham's consideration of what happens here is important. This idea of thinking about what it is that God has asked him to do. So in the next step of this, this is after Abraham leaves the other men that had come with them at the bottom of the mountain. There's a little bit of an analogy here to what's going to happen later when Moses, with the Ten Commandments, goes up to the top of the mountain to receive the law and leaves the Israelites behind. In this case, it's just Abraham and Isaac going up the mountain. And this is fascinating because here you see in the picture Isaac taking the wood up for the burnt offering, and this follows the text. So Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering, and he placed it upon his son Isaac. In other words, he asked Isaac to carry it. And he took into his hand the fire and the knife, and they both went together. So at this point, Abraham is ready for the sacrifice. He's got the knife and he's got the fire. And we understand exactly what this is going to mean because it's looking an awful lot like Abraham is going through with sacrificing his son. And Isaac spoke to Abraham, his father, and he said, "My father." And he said, "Here I am, my son." The same thing, right, that he says to God, he says to his child. So it's interesting, this conversation between God and man is also the conversation between father and son on earth. And he said, this is Isaac saying, "Here are the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" He's starting to get the picture, right? I don't see any offering here. Where is it going to be? And then Abraham says, "God will provide for himself the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." Now the question is Abraham lying here? He certainly hasn't been told by God that there's going to be a lamb given for the burnt offering. And there's nothing to suggest that that's true. So it's either a demonstration of faith, which is the way that the reading traditionally, what the reading suggests, or it's suggesting that somehow Abraham has an intuitive sense that God will provide because God provided Isaac in the first place, so this will happen again. Now, the penultimate moment, of course, is the sacrifice itself. And this is depicted in a lot of different ways. And we'll get into those a little bit in a minute. But the most important part of the text is what follows. And it's interesting, again, going back to this section, is notice that Isaac is somebody who speaks up, right? He says, where is the lamb? But when it comes to the actual sacrifice, Isaac says nothing. And his silence is an interesting thing here. It's either that he's accepted the fact that he's going to be sacrificed, or perhaps he's just too terrified to say anything. So let's go through this slowly because this is the key piece of the story. So they came to the place of which God had spoken to him, and Abraham built the altar there and arranged the wood, and he bound Isaac his son and placed him on the altar upon the wood. And Abraham stretched forth his hand and took the knife to slaughter his son. And notice that Isaac doesn't say a word here. The next word is going to be said by the angel, not from Isaac. So what's fascinating about this is frequently we forget the context for this sacrifice. The Canaanites, the people locally, were engaging in human sacrifice, and also the Sumerians were engaging in human sacrifice. So the original culture from which Avram came was one where human sacrifice was allowed. And even in India, human sacrifice was permitted. So the fact that this is being asked is not actually all that unusual in the time that request was being made. In other words, this wouldn't have been sort of as shocking as it appears to us today. But what's interesting is that Abraham is preparing Isaac for the slaughter. And he's doing all the things that would normally be done to an animal, but he's doing it to his son. And of course, what happens here is when God calls to Abraham through the angel, and he says again, "Here I am." Right? He always responds, "I am always present to you. I hear your voice," whether it's the voice of his conscience or the deeper voice that's coming outside of him from God. This idea that God tells him, "Do not stretch forth your hand to the lad, nor do the slightest thing to him, for now I know that you are a God-fearing man, and you did not withhold your son, again, your only one, from me. So what's fascinating about this is here is the first time in religious history where God is telling man that human sacrifice is not okay. You sacrifice animals, you do not sacrifice people. And then, of course, God provides the ram, and Abraham sacrifices the ram instead of his son. And so what we learn from this is that animal sacrifice is permissible, but that human sacrifice isn't. And this prohibition will be taken very seriously by the Jewish people. So this idea of do not murder, do not kill is being reinforced here. And if you think about it, it doesn't really get changed again until when you get to Christianity. If you look at what happens with Jesus, the sacrifice of Jesus, God's only son, is in some ways a return to human sacrifice, something that again, this is the problem from the Jewish perspective of Jesus and the story of Jesus, not only that he claims that he is the Son of God, or seems to be held that way by Christians, but also that God would allow his son to be sacrificed. So it's a violation of the understanding that comes from this story. So I think the most important thing here, there's so many questions that this engages, which is, well, why doesn't Isaac say anything in this moment where he's about to be sacrificed? Why is it an angel that comes down, the messenger of God, and not God himself? There's an awful lot to consider here. And obviously, Abraham's faith here is the thing that's going to be emphasized and seen as the most important thing. It's kind of the sealing of the deal. So to get to the very end of the story, shortly after this, in the next chapter of the Torah, Sarah dies. And for some people, they believe that, in the readings of this by the rabbis, is that she's so horrified by the fact that this almost happened that it kills her. That the idea that she was put through such a test just simply for Isaac to be born, that after this, for Abraham to cavalierly go off and almost sacrifice him is just too much for her to handle. So Sarah's death is almost an extension of the story, and Abraham dies shortly after this. So it's sort of the final part of his life. It's also interesting to look at the age that Isaac may have been. In the Bible, you see pictures of him as a young man, other pictures of him as a child. The rabbinical consensus is that Isaac is an older boy. Obviously, he can carry the wood up to the sacrifice. He's between his teenage years and his 30s. And again, there's just debate about that. So again, it calls into question why somebody, an old man, would be able to sacrifice his son. It certainly speaks to Isaac's willingness to be put through that sacrifice. And you see this in these pictures, that Isaac is not fighting back. He himself is also surrendering to God's will. Now, it's fascinating how Jews look at this, because obviously there are going to be other moments in their history where their people are going to be sacrificed, right? Through the pogroms. If you don't know what that is, that's where the Russian Tsar comes and kills large numbers of Jews during the Crusades, during the Holocaust. And Elie Wiesel, who's a famous Jewish writer, writes this: all the pogroms, the Crusades, the persecutions, the slaughters, the catastrophes, the massacres by sword, and the liquidations by fire, each time it was Abraham leading his son to the altar and to the Holocaust all over again. So this idea that the Jews continually have to examine their faith in light of this threat of destruction. And so for a Jewish person, how do you view this? If you are in Isaac's position, what do you do? What do you do when you're threatened? And the final question that this raises is, in the face of this terrifying and unsafe world in which we live, where we can be sacrificed, hopefully not by our parents, but by the circumstances of the world around us, what is the best response? Do we act through faith? Do we act dramatically? Do we scream? How do we react here? And that's the Jewish question. How do you react when God asks you to do something and when your faith is tested? What do you do? Do you fight or do you surrender?